Mr. Halloran knew you were 3 days behind on your bill, and he never said a word about it. He knew your mother liked her bacon sliced thick, not thin. He knew which kid in the neighborhood was allowed penny candy, and which one's mother had asked him, quietly, not to sell it to her son, no matter how much he begged. He knew all of this because he'd been standing behind that same counter for 22 years, in the same small grocery store, on the same corner. And you were not a customer to him. You were a name, a family, a story he'd been watching unfold, one grocery run at a time, since before you could walk. By 1962, men like Mr. Halloran were running out of time, and almost none of them knew it yet. This is a story about a building. A small one, usually just a single room with a counter up front and maybe a walk-in cooler in the back. The kind of grocery store that used to sit on practically every corner of every American neighborhood. And it's a story about what replaced it. Something so much bigger, so much cheaper, and so much more convenient, that within about a decade, stores like Mr. Halloran's simply stopped existing in most of the country. I want to take you through exactly how that happened, because I don't think it's the story most people assume it is. Let's start with what the corner grocery store actually was, because if you've never set foot in one, it's genuinely hard to picture from a description alone. These were small, family-run operations, often literally family-owned for generations, sitting in the middle of a residential neighborhood rather than out on a commercial strip. You walked there. That's an important detail. In most American neighborhoods through the 1950s and into the early 60s, the grocery store was close enough that a housewife could walk to it daily, sometimes more than once a day, picking up exactly what was needed for that night's dinner, rather than stocking up for a whole week.
The owner, almost always a man, stood behind the counter himself. And this is the part that I think genuinely separated this kind of shopping from anything most of us have experienced. He took your order, sometimes literally. You told him what you needed, and he or a clerk fetched it from the shelves behind the counter, since a lot of these stores weren't even self-service in the earliest version of this format. He extended credit informally to families who were short that week, keeping a running tab in a small notebook, trusting that it would get paid eventually, because he'd known that family for a decade and knew they were good for it. He knew which households had a new baby and quietly set aside the freshest milk for them. He remembered, without writing it down, that the Petrosky family couldn't eat pork, and the Kowalskis always wanted their bread the day it came in, not the day after. None of this was charity, and it wasn't sentimentality either, even though it looks that way from a distance. It was simply how a small local business survived for decades in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and where a grocer's reputation, his honesty, his memory, his willingness to extend a little grace during a hard month was as much a part of his inventory as the cans on his shelf. If you're the kind of person who likes seeing how these small, ordinary pieces of American life actually worked, go ahead and subscribe to Vintage Table USA, because we walk through a different one of these every single week. Now, the supermarket wasn't actually new in 1962. That's the part that surprises people. The format had existed since the 1930s, with early chains like Piggly Wiggly and King Cullen pioneering the basic idea of self-service shopping. Big stores, wide aisles, customers picking their own products off the shelf and carrying them to a checkout themselves instead of asking a clerk to fetch everything. What changed by 1962 wasn't the invention of the supermarket. It was the speed at which it finally, completely overtook the small grocer. And a few very specific forces lined up at once to make that happen. First, the interstate highway system, only a few years into construction by this point, was reshaping where people lived and how they got around. Suburbs were expanding rapidly through the late 1950s and early 60s, and suburban living assumed a car. A family living in a new development outside the city wasn't walking 3 blocks to a corner store anymore. They were driving, which meant the entire logic of neighborhood-scale shopping started to break down, replaced by something built around parking lots and weekly trips. Second, the home refrigerator and the home freezer had become standard equipment in American kitchens by this point, which sounds unrelated to grocery shopping until you think it through. A housewife in 1945 without much cold storage had to shop frequently, in small amounts, because food spoiled fast. A housewife in 1962, with a proper refrigerator and often a separate freezer compartment, could buy a week's worth of groceries in a single trip and actually keep it fresh. That single shift in home appliances did more to make supermarket shopping practical than almost anything else happening at the time. And third, simple economics. A supermarket, buying in enormous bulk directly from manufacturers and distributors, could sell a can of vegetables for noticeably less than Mr. Halloran could, because Mr. Halloran was buying small quantities through a regional wholesaler and had nowhere near that kind of purchasing leverage. By 1962, supermarket chains controlled a rapidly growing share of total American grocery sales, and independent corner grocers, who had dominated the business for generations, were closing at a pace that genuinely alarmed trade publications covering the industry at the time. I want to slow down on something here, because I think it's the most important part of this whole story, and it's easy to miss if you only look at the prices. The supermarket won on price and convenience, fair and square, in a purely economic sense. Lower prices, longer hours, one stop for everything instead of separate trips to the butcher, the baker, and the grocer, a week's worth of shopping accomplished in a single visit with a car to haul it all home. Almost nobody, faced honestly with that choice in 1962, would have picked the smaller, pricier, less convenient option out of pure sentiment. People went where the better deal was, the same way people have always gone where the better deal is, and there's nothing wrong or foolish about that decision. But something besides price changed hands in that transaction. Something the family driving home with a trunk full of groceries from the new supermarket usually didn't notice until much later, if they noticed it at all. The corner grocer wasn't just selling food. He was, almost as a side effect of his job, holding a small piece of the neighborhood's social fabric together. He was the person who noticed if an elderly customer hadn't come in for her usual order in over a week and might check in on her. He was the person who quietly extended credit during a job loss without making a family feel ashamed for needing it. He was, in a small but very real way, a kind of informal social safety net that nobody had designed on purpose, that simply existed because a small business owner's livelihood depended on actually knowing his customers as people. A checkout clerk at a supermarket in 1962, however friendly, didn't have that same relationship with you, and, structurally, couldn't. The store was too big, the staff turned over too often. The whole point of the format was efficiency at scale, not personal familiarity. That's not a criticism of the supermarket. It's just a description of what a different kind of business, built for a different purpose, naturally does and doesn't provide. We're getting into the part of this story I find most worth sitting with. And if it's resonating with you, a like on this video genuinely helps it find other people who'd appreciate this kind of honest look back. Let's put some real numbers on this, because I think the scale of what happened in this single decade is genuinely hard to grasp without them. In 1948, independent grocery stores still accounted for roughly 70% of all food retail sales in the United States. By 1963, just 15 years later, that share had collapsed to somewhere closer to 30%, with supermarket chains controlling the rest. The Department of Commerce, tracking retail trends through this period, documented thousands of small independent grocers closing their doors every single year through the late 1950s and early 1960s, a pace that food industry trade journals at the time openly described as the disappearance of an entire category of small business, not just a gradual decline. What happened to the actual buildings afterward tells its own quiet story. Some became other small businesses entirely. A barber shop, a shoe repair counter, a dry cleaner. Anything that didn't compete on the same volume-driven economics that had just put the grocer out of business. Others sat empty for years, A familiar, slightly sad fixture on residential corners throughout the 1960s and 70s, the faded outline of old hand-painted lettering still visible on the brick long after the shelves inside had been cleared out. A number of these buildings were eventually converted into something residential, an apartment, a small office, erasing almost any visible trace that a neighborhood grocery store had ever stood there at all. I find something quietly haunting about that particular detail.
An entire category of building, once common enough that most American children could walk to one from their own front door, became rare enough within about 20 years that an entire generation grew up never having set foot inside one, with no real way of knowing exactly what they were missing, because the building itself simply stopped being identifiable as anything other than wherever it eventually became. Let's talk about what actually happened to men like Mr. Halloran, because the story usually just ends at the supermarket won, and that skips over a whole human cost that deserves more attention than it gets. Many small grocers simply closed within a few years of a supermarket opening nearby, unable to compete on price for staple goods that customers could find dramatically cheaper just a short drive away. Some held on by specializing, leaning hard into fresh produce, ethnic specialty items, or personal service for an older customer base that valued the relationship enough to pay slightly more for it. A smaller number converted their stores into something else entirely: a deli, a specialty shop, anything that didn't compete head-on with a format built for volume they could never match. For the men running these stores, often the second or even third generation of their family to do so, this wasn't simply a business closing. It was frequently the end of an identity that had defined their family for decades. The loss of a role in the neighborhood that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being known, needed, and trusted by the people around them. Trade publications and local newspapers through the 1960s carried more than a few stories of grocers in their 50s and 60s closing up for the last time, uncertain what else they were even qualified to do after a lifetime spent behind that one counter. I don't think this part of the story gets told often enough, and I think it deserves to be. Not because the supermarket was wrong to exist, but because real people experienced something close to grief over a building most of us would now drive right past without a second thought. I want to be honest about something here too, because I don't think nostalgia should erase the parts of this story that genuinely don't deserve to be missed. The corner grocery store wasn't some kind of utopia. Prices were often genuinely higher, sometimes a meaningful amount higher, especially hard on families with the least room in their budget to absorb that difference. Selection was limited, often dramatically so compared to what a supermarket could offer, particularly for fresh produce out of season or any product beyond the basics. And informal credit, while it sounds warm and generous from a distance, could also trap a family in a quiet, ongoing debt to a single shopkeeper they had no real alternative to, especially in neighborhoods where one grocer effectively had no nearby competition at all. So when we talk today about what was lost when the corner grocery store disappeared, I don't think the honest answer is everything was better. The honest answer is narrower, and it's this. Something was lost in the exchange that the supermarket's lower prices and longer hours never tried to replace. Because replacing it wasn't really the supermarket's job in the first place. We gained real, tangible value. We also quietly lost something that nobody had priced into the transaction at all, because it never had a price tag to begin with. Here's the thought I keep coming back to about all of this. Mr. Halloran, and the thousands of men like him across the country, didn't lose to a worse business. They lost to a genuinely better one, by almost every measure that shows up on a receipt. And I think that's actually the most honest, least comfortable part of this whole story. Sometimes the thing that gets left behind isn't defeated by something inferior. It's defeated by something objectively superior at the one thing it was built to do, while quietly, almost accidentally, doing something else that nobody had asked it to do, and that nobody thought to measure until it was already gone.
We didn't choose to give up being known by the person who sold us our groceries. Nobody voted on that. We just chose the better price, over and over, millions of times, in millions of separate, perfectly reasonable decisions. And one day the corner store wasn't there to choose instead, because the choice itself had quietly disappeared, some time while we weren't watching for it. If your family ever had a Mr. Halloran of their own, a corner grocer who knew your name, extended a little grace during a hard month, or simply remembered exactly how you liked your bacon sliced, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. These small, ordinary stories rarely make it into any history book, and every time someone shares one here, it keeps a piece of this country's actual, lived history a little more alive than it would otherwise be. If this kind of honest look at how American life actually changed is something you'd like more of, go ahead and subscribe to Vintage Table USA. There's a lot more of this country's everyday history still waiting to be walked through, one ordinary building at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.